good, because we're actually going to look at the beginning. Okay, so
We are on.
Beshallach. We're out. We're free, kinda. Right? We could have finished with last week's Torah portion where we had our Seder. We got out of Egypt. Everybody was waving the flags. Roll credits. But there's a sequel. That is to say, and now the journey begins. And the journey has to begin in order that we can go from Egypt to, where are we headed?
No.
Canaan, right? Canaan, which is going to be later called the land of Israel. But at the time, it's still called Canaan because Israel is the group of people walking around, right? It's not a country yet. It's still a people. And eventually, when they settle in Canaan, it will become identified by them. But at the moment, we're going to refer to it as Canaan or Canaan, if you want the English pronunciation. All right, let's do a quick Geography 101. All right, so
Okay,
we've got Egypt over here.
huh?
Mediterranean.
Yeah.
This is the Mediterranean, yeah.
Yeah.
Right? This is
Once the,
that's all water, right? That's all water.
Okay.
And we've got this
Sinai
thing
Peninsula.
called
Yep.
Sinai,
Sea of
right? And then we've got more
Red
water, right? And this is now called the Red Sea. And then there's this other bit that goes off this way, and this is a Gulf, right? Gulf of Eilat.
Eilat or
Arabia.
Aqaba,
Or,
depending
yeah,
upon-
depending upon which political persuasion you happen to have. Right, and then we've got, I'll just do the quick sketch, right? We've got the Galilee, and we've got the Dead Sea, boom, boom, boom. Okay, so we're down in Egypt. We got all of our people.
Right.
Where are we headed?
We're going, but we're not going to go
Hold
by
on,
land.
where are we headed?
We're
No.
heading to Canaan.
Right, so that means that if you were going to actually, if you were actually going to travel between Egypt and the land of Canaan, you would use
The main road.
Follow the sea.
a road like that, following the coastline, exactly, which was the main road. There was tons of traffic going back and forth between here, right? Egypt had a presence in the land of Canaan. That was always there. That was always their projection into Asia and into Europe out of Africa, and vice versa. There were Asiatics that also had a projection into Egypt. This was a busy thoroughfare.
Right.
Right? It's the I-4, right? At least, right? At least.
Yeah.
But where do the Israelites end up?
Well, it says in the text that they certainly not going to go that way because this.
Well, we're going to talk about where do they end up, one piece at a time. We'll talk about why they go a different route in a
Sinai, they
second.
go south.
They go whoop, but first they do this, and then they go that.
Yeah, they cross the marshland.
Well, but there's this weird backpedaling, backing up on themselves as well that we're going to talk about. But then they end up in Sinai, probably nearish the tip. It's still not 100% clear exactly where Har Sinai officially is. God did not necessarily. We've got a nice map in the back of the. If you want to look in full color and slightly better drawing than my own. What page is that?
It's not in.
Doesn't have a page number.
No, just
It's after 1,500.
and 12, 13.
Okay, 1,512 is where you hit the color.
Right.
If you have the version that actually has the color, and then you'll see
Then you can see the.
the larger map of Sinai. So there is a presumption that Mount
There's
Sinai
two
is
routes.
probably down here near the tip, which is the wrong direction to go. Now, just a quick reminder, the Israelites end up here for 40 years, not at Mount Sinai, but end up in this area for 40 years rather than ending up in the land of Israel. When they finally do get to the land of Israel, they're going to go like that to get in, which is like, but we'll talk about that when we, do Bamidbar at some point. But that 40 years is not spent wandering around, right? They're not lost. And it isn't because it's so far. This is not Texas that they are trying to cross on foot. And even if it were Texas, remember people, the pioneers in America, crossed the country in a matter of like a month or two on foot anyway. So there's no reason why this should take 40 years other than God tells them to wait, which, like I said, we'll talk about when we do the book of Numbers sometime. But the question is, from the start, how did they end up here? Why aren't they using this route? what's going on with their travel plans, because it looks like someone didn't bother to buy a map before they left Egypt, and they're just totally lost. At least that's also what Pharaoh thinks as well. Okay, so let's take a look at the parasha, page 399. We're going to start with the beginning, and we'll see what's going on and what they're thinking. Do I have a volunteer? Thank you, John.
Now, when Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them by way of the land of the Philistines, although it was nearer.
Wait, who?
God.
Who are these people? The Philistines, right?
The
So,
Philistines.
what is the land of, what's that?
Don't start.
Yeah, that's what happens when you recycle terminology.
Yeah.
Right.
So
So,
let's see what the cities of the coast.
Didn't say nothing.
okay. So, this area is you get my
Ashkelon,
this
Yeah,
area in
Ashkelon
here
in there.
is generally considered to be the Philistine territory, right?
Right.
This was the area, give or take expansion, sometimes further in, sometimes further north, but the area that nowadays is mostly demarcated by Gaza and some areas around it. If you were looking at a modern Israeli map, right? Ashkelon, exactly,
Ashkelon.
and further in, inland as well, was the area that was dominated by the Philistine culture, population, and then they had an extended area of influence of their army, which is why they were giving King David later on so much trouble. So that's the area that apparently God doesn't want us going through. So now we can begin to answer the question. Why are we going this way? Because God doesn't want us to go through the land of the Philistines. But of course, that leads to the second question, which is, why not? Why doesn't God want us to go through the land of the Philippines? Because we've already said it is closer. I will point out that kikarovhu, the phrase for it is closer, is going to be a subject of debate among the commentary, right? Because kikarovhu, we got three little words, and all of them can be argued about. So first of all, ki, right? Ki normally means because,
With.
right? Because, but here we have it as although, as a translation. Right? God did not take them through the land of the Philistines because it was nearer, is a very different feeling than God did not take them through the land of the Philistines, although it was nearer.
and I have a translation, which is nearer.
Which is more neutral, right? Which was nearer, which is like saying, you know, this is this independent little clause floating there. And then also, of course, the question is, what is it? Right? It, in English, beautiful word, does not exist in Hebrew.
Correct.
Right? There is no non-living gender-neutral pronoun in Hebrew.
Yeah.
Right? There's no it. So the word who is the one. So what is the pronoun who referring to? Here, the translation is the land, right? That the land is what was closer. That's not the only way to read that, right? Because what other nouns have we had that could also be translated as being who?
Pharaoh.
Philistine.
The Philistines would be plural, so that would be a they. That'd be a hem.
He.
Pharaoh,
God.
God.
Pharaoh or God, right? Now, Pharaoh is not here, so that making it closer doesn't make sense. But indeed, some of the commentators say it's not talking about the land, it's talking about God, right? Because God was close. Close to yeah, we're going to get there. We're going to get there. All right. I just wanted to point out that just three little words can be very confusing if you actually look at them with an open sense of what could this possibly mean. All right. So why did we not go this way? Well, we're going to get a little bit of explanation, which is kind of weird. Because remember, usually when the Torah makes a decision, it doesn't tell us why. It just tells us this is what's going to happen.
This is what tripped me up. For God said, the people may have a change of heart when they see war and return to Egypt. So God led the people round about by way of the wilderness at the Sea of Reeds.
Okay. That made it all clear, right?
Yeah.
No.
So what's unusual about that description of what's going on here?
First, we have this interjection, God saying to himself.
Yep. How often do we get to hear God's inner monologue?
In Genesis, we God says about people, their inclination is evil from birth. That's
All
the
right, so
last I can
the
remember.
prelude before the destruction of the flood, right before he elects Noah and goes on through
Right.
that, the internal monologue in response to Adam and Eve eating the fruit, and he says,
Right.
"Oh, what happens if they do this?"
God says to himself.
The
right.
decision of will I destroy Sodom and Gomorrah and not talk to
Right.
Abraham about this? That's about it.
Right.
Right? We don't get the internal monologue of God all that often. It is very, very unusual. We see God's speeches, we see God's actions. We don't hear God's
Wonder.
going, I wonder. Well, wait a minute, because why would we not hear that?
And that's what threw me.
What's the problem with having God wondering about this?
He's the Almighty.
He doesn't know?
He doesn't know.
Right.
Yeah.
Right?
Doesn't he know all the past and the
Exactly. I mean,
future and the present?
If I flip a coin, I wonder if it will be heads or tails. Presumably, God doesn't have to wonder whether it's going to be heads or tails, not just because God could make it either, but because God already knows what it will be. If you are omniscient, how are you perhaps in any of your thought bubbles? How can you have a wonderment about any of the eventual outcome of any particular action? And so this is indeed going to be a big problem, and it's going to be the focus of our conversation. So apparently, I heard that you were struggling with this, and I must have been tuned in to that. But let's just get a little bit more about how they're being led, because it is a very important structure.
So God led the people round about by way of the wilderness at the Sea of Reeds.
Right. Remember, wilderness is what is usually translated as desert.
Desert.
Right, the Midbar. But since desert has a particular geological terminology in modern English, and wilderness, Midbar, has a particular meaning in the terminology of biblical Hebrew, they translate it as wilderness. A Midbar is a place where people don't live. Right? It is a place of non-inhabitants.
Desolate.
So desolate again in America means uninhabitable, right? It means you couldn't live there. Midbar means uninhabited. It had not been settled. It was not settled by people. Now, presumably, it's not settled because it's not easy to live there, right? It's not. It is because it's a desolate place, because it's a place without rainfall, and which we would call a desert, and all of that. But the connotation, the feeling of the word midbar in biblical Hebrew was very much, this was no man's land. Right? This was the middle of nowhere. Nobody lived there. It wasn't just about its desirability or undesirability. It was about no neighbors. That's more what we get from the feeling of midbar in the biblical sense. It's not just about precipitation. Onward.
And this is the one that really confused me. Now the Israelites went up armed out of the land of Egypt. And Moses took with him the bones of Joseph, who had exacted an oath from the children of Israel, saying, God will be sure to take notice of you. Then you shall carry up my bones from here with you. They set out from Succoth and encamped at Etam at the edge of the wilderness. The Lord went before them in a pillar of cloud by day to guide them along the way, and in a pillar of fire by night to give them light, that they might travel day and night. The pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night did not depart from before the people.
Okay, so we have these giant beacons, whether it be cloud or fire, depending upon the time of day. Many people say it was a cloud illuminated by fire, and so at night the fire was more visible, and during day the cloud was more visible. That seems to be our signpost. Right? That's our GPS, our God positioning service, which is leading us in the direction that God wants us to go. The weird thing is going to be that this is going to take a direct route. In fact, in the next few little bits, in chapter 14, it's going to tell us that it looks like we're going in circles. It looks like we're doubling back on ourselves. There's some argument of exactly where some of these places are. You'll find them put down with great confidence on many maps of the Bible. I can tell you that all of those people are confident only because they copied it from someone else, and that person went, it's probably this one. And then the person who cites them acts as though this was received knowledge. So we don't know exactly where these places are, but we do know how people react to them in the text. And Pharaoh and his friends are going to react to it by saying, they don't seem like they know where they're going. And of course, the bigger bugaboo is they don't seem like they're coming back. Remember how we talked about
Yeah.
it? Pharaoh might have thought that this really was just going to be a 3-day out sacrifice, 3-day back journey. And it doesn't seem like they're doing that. And the big reason for all of that is the fact that we're not taking the straight route. Right? If we had just left and gone straight, then Pharaoh would have immediately known what was up and would have responded probably the way he does anyway. But even more, the fact that we don't seem to know where we're going makes Pharaoh think they really are lost, don't know what they're doing. They are totally vulnerable. If you've ever wondered why did Pharaoh, after having lived through all of those horrible plagues, all the things that Egypt lost, why did he think attacking us one more time was a good idea? Well, if it looks like now that we're out of Egypt, we're totally hopeless and lost, maybe their God has abandoned them. Maybe they are not going to have any great life on the horizon. Maybe they are vulnerable. And so for Pharaoh's change of heart, their strange little behavior here actually does seem to make a lot of sense. But we're not going to talk just about Pharaoh being sucked in. I want to talk more about what, for the Israelites, was going on here. And why didn't God just take us the straight route? Right? Why did God take a shortcut that added 40 years to our travel? And why does it seem like God is not even sure of what's about to happen with this whole, well, maybe they'll see war and then maybe they'll think, and is maybe in God's vocabulary? Okay, so with that, we're going to hit our commentaries. Go. Let's see if I can. You can tell how long someone's been a teacher by how well they can get the handouts to slide on the table.
Yeah, right.
Right, new teachers, it just doesn't go anywhere. You got to get just the right angle to get that cushion of air so that they slide. I come in and practice when you guys aren't here.
Yeah. They used to have those in bars.
Well, oh, you mean I thought you meant air hockey, but
No, they
when they would slide the
slide a metal piece down the
oh yeah, the shuffleboard, yeah, tabletop shuffleboard. Yeah. It's still around, just not as often. Yeah.
I don't hang out at many bars.
All right. So
You need to get out more, sure.
we're actually going to begin with a quote from Deuteronomy, and this is taken from Rambam's Guide for the Perplexed, and we're going to see how you can begin to understand what's going on with these changes of direction. All right. So if you don't mind, from who fed?
Who fed you in the wilderness with manna, but your fathers knew not, that he might humble you, and that he might test you to do you good at your latter end. Okay,
so the implication seems to be that during the time in the desert, God gave us this manna partly as a test, right? Partly as some sort of challenge for us to overcome. Now, Rambam's going to try and explain this in his own inimitable way.
This might induce us to think that God sometimes afflicts man for the purpose of increasing his reward. But in truth, this is not the case.
Okay, so first of all, major theological point of argument here. What Rambam is saying is that there are some people out there who say, when God makes your cow die, that is because God is testing you. God is giving you suffering. And the way that you deal with that suffering, or even just that you've had suffering, means that God will eventually reward you more greatly. Now, whether it be in this world or the next world, God is simply trying to increase your lottery winnings by giving you more misery now. And Rambam is saying, no. I should point out, there are many mainstream Jewish theories that say in certain circumstances that can be true. It's very, very important, however, to remember that all Jewish authorities say you don't get to decide for someone else whether that's true. So if your cow dies, I don't get to tell you. That's okay. God's just going to give you more reward later.
Right.
You can tell yourself that, according to some authorities, and Rambam is basically saying don't, but if you are following other authorities, you could tell yourself, I'm sure that this is something that for eventually I will be rewarded for. You can tell yourself that narrative. Your neighbor's not allowed to tell you that. Just like your neighbor's not allowed to tell you your cow died because you're a sinner. Your neighbor's not allowed to tell you that either. That one also, everyone agrees you are absolutely forbidden for just saying, that's why your cow died, because you broke Shabbat, because you whatever. You're not in a position to judge anyone else in that way. Okay, so Rambam's already made one massive theological statement. Let's see how he follows it up.
We may rather assume one of the two following explanations. Either this passage expresses the same idea as is expressed in the first and second passages,
There in Deuteronomy.
that is to show to all people whether faith in God is sufficient to secure man's maintenance and his relief from care and trouble or not.
All right, so the real test here and the real structuring for the people isn't that we're being tested by the manna by some form of trouble and misery, but instead we are being taught that if we have faith in God, we will be supported, even in the middle of the Sinai wilderness, even in the Midbar. And so that was what was going on here. It was a lesson for the nation to make them understand that indeed faith in God could sustain you. Onward.
Or the Hebrew term lenaso teka means to accustom you. The word is used in this sense in the following passage. She is not accustomed, the sole of her foot, to set it upon the ground.
So that's actually taken from a list of curses that will eventually befall Israel, and talking about how even somebody who is so prissy or so pampered, that's probably the better word, that she never has had to touch the dirty ground with her own foot, will eventually have this horrible, horrible condition. That's not the important part. The important part here is that you could read the word for test, not to mean test, but to mean accustom. That God wasn't trying to test us with hardship. God was trying to get us used to hardship, right? That we would actually get used to it. The same way that you might take your family camping and say, look, we're going to go out camping and we're not going to have phones and we're not going to have a heater and we're not going to have running water. I want you to get used to what life can be like without those things, because those experiences will build character, right? Said everybody ever before the camping trip ended in disaster. Okay, so.
The meaning of the above passage would then be, God has first trained you in the hardships of the wilderness in order to increase your welfare when you enter the land of Canaan.
Okay, so how is being experienced in the hardships of the wilderness going to make us happier when we get to Canaan? Well, Rambam's going to give us his psychological analysis.
It is indeed a fact that the transition from trouble to ease gives more pleasure than continual ease.
All right, so I just love the fact that he's like 1,000 years ahead of modern psychology, which is to say, if you have it hard and then it gets good, the good feels better than if you've always had it good. Right? Right? It's true. I mean, if you are sitting, if you're walking outside for an hour in 90-degree heat and you walk into an air-conditioned building, boy, does that feel good. But if you've sat in that air-conditioned building the entire day, you never left, and you go to bed that night, it's just sitting in your house, do you really appreciate the comfort that building is giving you? Does it really feel good? No. It's just normal. It's expected. And so by having us go through the trouble of the wilderness, we will have a better experience and a better appreciation when we finally enter the land of Canaan. Onward.
It is also known that the Israelites would not have been able to conquer the land and fight with its inhabitants if they had not previously undergone the trouble and hardship of the wilderness. Scripture says in reference to this, "For God said, lest peradventure the people repent when they see war, and they return to Egypt."
Which is his translation of our verse.
Yeah.
Ease destroys bravery, while trouble and care for food create strength. And this was the good that ultimately came out of their wanderings in the wilderness.
Okay, so basically, the entire time in the desert, that's our training montage. In any movie where they want to show the hero going from being some 90-pound weakling to being the strapping, buff guy, they show you a whole bunch of clips of him running through the snow and punching sides of beef and, for fighting, his way, up a mountain and, punching rocks or whatever it takes, these little clips to show him building up himself. That's what Bamidbar is, right? It's our training montage as a nation. That God wanted to give us trouble so that we would toughen up, And then when we hit the land of Israel, boy, would we appreciate it. And boy, would we be ready to fight for it. Because without it, we would have had trouble.
What does he mean by ease destroys bravery?
It means if you live a comfortable, pampered life, you become a wimp.
You become,
Yeah.
Yeah.
you don't have,
It's the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. They became accustomed to their prosperous ease, and then when threats arose, they weren't able to meet them.
Or, as also happened in Rome, they were more interested in hiring someone to meet the threat than doing it themselves.
Right.
here we are.
Right? I mean, if you are accustomed to comfort and there is a crisis, it is harder for you to adjust and overcome that.
Okay.
I mean, it's in all of those wonderful, apocalyptic movies, right? Where you have the end of civilization, the zombies rising, the epidemic sweeping the globe,
Yes, I want
right?
those.
It is not the socialites from Beverly Hills that are coming out victorious, right? Or if it is, it's because they have given up all of that, and now they've, tied a bandana with a Gucci bag around their head, and now they're tough, right?
It's
But
Red Dawn.
it is the people that are already considered to have gone through hardship, right? If there was an apocalypse, who would you bet on? The person who grew up poor or the person who grew up rich? Assuming they don't get to keep their, valuables in the process.
The poor kid from the farm or the rich kid from the city.
Right. I mean, the general instinct is someone who's gone through trouble is going to be more able to overcome trouble than someone who's never faced trouble in their life. It's not always a fair assumption, and there are plenty of people who have faced trouble that when they face new trouble, it's one trouble too many and they fall apart.
Right.
And there are plenty of people who are actually capable of overcoming great hardship, even though they've never experienced it in their life.
Right.
It's not a one-to-one, always 100% true, but as a rule of thumb, it does seem to have a lot going for it. And this is the idea that Rambam is saying. It's not that we couldn't have won if we had gone up. It's not that we wouldn't have won. It's that we wouldn't have appreciated Israel, and we wouldn't have done well with that whole battle because we weren't quite brave enough. We needed our training scenes to get ready.
Already.
And then we come up.
They were not ready.
They weren't
were
ready.
Slaves. Still slaves.
They were still
They were
slaves.
armed.
Now, you might ask yourself, however, but wait a minute. They were slaves. Is there a greater hardship to overcome than living a life of slavery in pharaonic Egypt? I mean, exactly what more toughness do they need? This is taking the bottom of the barrel and then saying, no, you need to go under the barrel before you're tough enough.
They had food, they had places to live.
Okay, so slavery was tough, but it wasn't tough. Right? Slavery had,
Training for freedom.
what's that?
It wasn't training for freedom.
It wasn't training for freedom, right? They were kept, and that did keep them from having the freedom to know how to support themselves completely. Otherwise, they would have been able to leave long before Moses showed up. So there is, toughness and then toughness. So they certainly had toughness to endure the slavery, but they weren't quite ready to have the toughness needed for their freedom. All right, so that's Rambam's idea. Chizkuni has a very different explanation of why we needed this detour away from the land of the Philistines.
For God had said, lest the people have remorse. We must not criticize this verse by saying that it cannot be reconciled with God's omniscience.
Right? Our question, wait a minute, what do you mean lest? What do you mean maybe? God knows everything. How can God have a maybe?
That is, that he did not know all of this in advance.
He did.
Besides, surely if God had wanted to, he could have led the Israelites through the land of the Philistines without their coming to any harm.
All right. So as we've talked about before, but Chizkuni gives it in brilliant, shorter language than I usually do. If God had wanted to put an invisible bubble of protection around the Israelites while they walked through the Philistines, they could have. God just did 10 massive plagues. You think he couldn't have protected us walking through the Philistines? So therefore, there has to be a reason other than God doubting what would happen when we encounter the fight with the Philistines. So here's his explanation.
However, what is written here is an answer to the attribute of justice, which wanted to exploit that opportunity to accuse the Israelites of lack of faith in their God, precisely because God was aware that the Israelites were not yet in a condition to withstand the Satan he decided not to give the adversary that opportunity at this time.
So just a reminder that the phrase Satan means adversary in Hebrew, and it's not meant to necessarily be the proper noun of somebody with horns and a pitchfork, right? This is, as you can see, an operative from the aspect of justice. Right? This is not the unholy opposition of God. That is an entirely different set of faith beliefs. Judaism sees this as being an operative of the side of justice. And the justice is saying, look, God, these people really don't have faith in you. Right? This is the same argument in the book of Job, by the way. Look, this guy, he's got everything good, and he doesn't really have faith for you. He's just happy because he's got everything good, which, by the way, was right. Right? Job did fail the test. He also succeeded as well, which is why the book is long, but he also fails. It's important to remember that when we talk about the patience of Job, that, he was patient for the first couple chapters, and then he let loose. So this idea that there is this adversary that is always telling God about all of our mistakes, of all of our foibles, of all of our weaknesses, means God does not want to give an opportunity for that to be proven right. Basically, God doesn't want to test us. God doesn't want us to be in a position where we're going to run away. Yes, of course, God will protect us and save us, but he doesn't want us to have the experience of collapse in the face of danger. And so he's trying to steer us away from where we would show that we do not yet have all the faith that we should have, despite all the 10 plagues and everything else that will have happened. Position makes sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So it's not God's weakness, it's our weakness, and God is trying to steer us away from it. On to Rabbeinu Bachya.
The words, perhaps the people will reconsider, are hard to understand. Do we not believe that there is no such thing as the word perhaps in God's vocabulary? Does he not know all in advance? Clearly, God knew for certain how the Israelites would react when they saw they had to fight the Philistines. The meaning of the words, perhaps the people will reconsider, therefore must be so that the people will not reconsider.
All right, so instead of reading pen as being perhaps, which is the usual way that it's translated, or lest they do this, which is also a statement of doubt, instead read it as so they don't do this, right? Lest in the prohibitive sense, meaning I won't let this happen, so they won't do this. Not because it might happen, but to prevent it from happening. Make sense?
Yeah.
All right. So he knew everything that was going to happen. You just need to translate the word a little differently than its usual phrase. And as we've already established, just today, as well as many other times, words don't always mean the same thing for everyone at every time and every place. Just like our discussion about the desert and the midbar and wilderness and what those desolation, what those words can mean and they can feel like. The word pen, it's perfectly reasonable to read it that way. How do we know that? Keep reading.
Indeed, our sages are on record that whenever the expression pen or the word Baal occurs in the Bible, the meaning is so that not. Examples, Genesis 3:22.
Which is after the eating of the tree.
Right. And now, so that he will not also stretch out his hand and take from the tree of life, etc. God meant it was not appropriate to give Adam an opportunity to take from the fruit of the tree of life and to nullify the decree that he had become mortal. Similarly here, God led the people through the desert instead of through the land of the Philistines in order not to grant them an opportunity to regret having left Egypt.
Okay, so both Chizkuni and Rabbeinu Bachya are talking about opportunities and avoiding opportunities. In English, opportunity always sounds nice, but sometimes there are opportunities for mistakes. What's the difference between their opinion? Why are their commentaries actually different? Think about who the opportunity is for.
One is for God, the other is the people.
Well, one is for the people, right? He doesn't want to give us the opportunity to mess up.
The attribute of justice.
The attribute of justice, or Satan, the adversary, is the one who has the opportunity in Chizkuni, right? In Chizkuni, he's saying, look, God was worried, not worried, but knew that the attribute of justice would rightly be able to question the faith of the people, and therefore God did not want to give a chance for that person to bring that case against the people at that time. And conversely, Rabbeinu Bachya is saying, no. It wasn't about the attribute of justice. It was about the actual failure of the people, right? They would have done this. And God's not in question about whether they would or wouldn't have done it. God is simply going to avoid putting them in the position where they have to do that, because that is what they will do. They will run. They will be afraid. They will return to Egypt if they see the fight. And even though you might think, well, if they can't fight for themselves, then maybe they belong as slaves. God is saying, no. Why would I put them in a position where they end up back in Egypt? Let them develop, let them grow, as Rambam said, and then we'll be able to do a lot more with them.
So is it avoiding putting the stumbling block in front of the blind man?
That's a very good way of putting it. Avoiding putting the stumbling block before the blind. Right? They are God is trying to steer their behaviors in a way that will make sense for them there and then. But we, the reader, and indeed the earlier readers as well of the Torah, would have known that this is a stupid route in general, that everyone would have known he should have gone this way. And so for God to deviate is actually telling us that this is God kindly protecting us from ourselves, right? That we are going to fail. This is the same kind of principle that if you have a friend who is a recovering alcoholic, you don't hand him or her a beer and say, well, if they have the willpower, they'll avoid it. And if not, well, I guess they're still enough. No, that's not fair. It's not fair to do that. And God is trying to be as fair to us as possible. It's going to turn out we need still even more fairness. That's why we get stuck there for 40 years. But God is trying to steer us in the way that will help us learn how to be the people we need to be before we get to the land of Israel as best as possible. And that is where we are with Rabbeinu Bachya.
Okay,
Yeah.
I'm going to be very picky here.
Be picky.
Okay.
That's why we have books.
Okay. So they're going to go south of Sinai. Now, it makes sense to go south of the Sinai because Moses was in Sinai, where Eilat would be today, which was a major arms dealing manufacturing area.
Right. When Moses was in Midian, right?
Yeah,
It's roughly vaguely thought to be somewhere around that area. Right. Sort of the Saudi Arabian, southern Jordanian zone.
So he
give or take which century.
He had family and support there. I mean, he would have and arms and things like that by going the southern route.
He could hope for a warm reception here as opposed to what he had here.
Yeah.
However, there's a couple problems with that theory. One, he doesn't get to this area for a long time. Even just by going to Mount Sinai, they get delayed there for a couple of years.
Yeah.
And two, when they finally do approach Midian, they are not greeted warmly at all. Right? That is why Midian and Moab come out and try to destroy Israel. So whatever family connection Moses may have had with the Midianites, they don't seem to be honoring when the Israelites get close to their border. So as looking for an ally might seem reasonable because of the family connection, it does not seem like the Midianites agreed. So hopefully Moses would have known that in advance, because otherwise he would have been rather shocked.
Jethro came out to him.
He did indeed. He did indeed. Okay. Back to Rambam, because Rambam wants us to understand how all of this plays into how we understand everything. Right? That this little verse about God choosing the right way for us to go and why God did it and the way God did it is actually a window through which we can understand all of God's behavior and our own role and purpose in life. So this is big stuff. Big picture question coming, or big picture lesson coming up from Rambam.
Many precepts in our law are the result of a similar course adopted by the same supreme being.
That is to say, choosing to do something which on the surface doesn't seem like the most direct route.
It is impossible to go suddenly from one extreme to the other. It is therefore, according to the nature of man, impossible for him suddenly to discontinue everything to which he has been accustomed.
Very few people quit smoking cold turkey, right? It's just not the way that is usually successful for the majority of people.
Now God sent Moses to make the Israelites a kingdom of priests and a holy nation by means of the knowledge of God. Compare unto, and this is from Deuteronomy, unto you it was showed that you might know that the Lord is God. Know therefore this day and consider it in thine heart that the Lord is God.
All right, so first of all, just always key in what Rambam is reminding us as the purpose of this journey and exposure to Torah and Moses and all of this is so that we will have knowledge of God. Right? That is the primary purpose of everything we're doing here, is that we will have knowledge. And knowledge doesn't mean, yeah, there is a God. It means truly understanding with as much depth as the human mind can what God is, the nature of God's existence, the nature of our relationship with God, and all those other details.
Well, there's knowledge, and then there's the understanding that comes from the experience.
And we're talking about full, deep comprehension, not merely knowledge of existence.
The Israelites were commanded to devote themselves to his service. But the custom which was in those days general among all men, and the general mode of worship in which the Israelites were brought up, consisted in sacrificing animals, etc.
He goes on in much more detail, which I didn't have space for on the page, to go, sacrificing animals, having temples, doing all of these other rituals, all of the things that are in Leviticus that we've talked about before seem a little unnecessary. Rambam is arguing those weren't unnecessary. Those were an important step because the Israelites couldn't be expected to stop doing everything they had seen and do none of it, because that would be too radical a jump for a person.
It was in accordance with the wisdom and plan of God that he did not command us to give up all these manners of service. For to obey such a commandment would have been contrary to the nature of man, who holds to that to which he is used. It would have made the same impression as if a prophet, now he called us to the service of God and told us that we should not pray to him, not fast, not seek his help in time of trouble, that we should serve him in thought and not by any action.
Right. So if there was a true prophet, which there wasn't in the time of Rambam, and there hasn't been for a very long time, and that true prophet said, now God doesn't want us to pray anymore. Right? God doesn't want us to fast on Yom Kippur. God doesn't want us to do any of the actual active mitzvot. We would also say, what? What do you mean you want me to just sit and think about God? What do you mean that's serving God? That makes no sense. I have to do something, don't I? That's the same feeling that the Israelites in Egypt, or leaving Egypt, would have also said. They said, no, you can pray to God. You don't need to kill an animal. They would have said, what? What do you mean I'm going to worship God without an animal? That makes no sense. And therefore God said, fine, we'll use some animals. It's okay. We'll do it in this way, so it's limited and it's, not according to your own weird imaginations. But yes, you're right. Asking you to jump straight into another relationship that is so different than what you've seen, that might be asking a little too much. So have a goat, kill it, we'll be good. God always speaks with an old Yiddish accent. That's George Burns. All right, onward.
For this reason, God allowed these kinds of service to continue. I know that you will at first thought reject this idea and find it strange. You will put the following question to me in your heart. How can we suppose that divine commandments should not have been commanded for their own sake?
Right? That's what you were all wondering. It's like, wait a minute. You're telling me that God didn't actually think the sacrifices in and of themselves were a good idea? That was just pacifying our own limited human ability to make a transition from one mode of worship to another? But would God really have commanded these things if they weren't worth something in and of themselves? That's our first question.
Hear my answer, which will show you the truth. There occurs in the law a passage which contains exactly the same idea.
And guess which sentence that is?
13:17.
Which is what we've been talking about having to use the detour and not going through the land of the Philistines.
Here, God led the people about, away from the direct road which he originally intended, because he feared they might meet on that way with hardships too great for their strength. He took them by another road in order to obtain his original object. In the same manner, God refrained from prescribing what the people, by their natural disposition, would be incapable of obeying.
God wouldn't command what we couldn't do. The commandments we have are commandments that are adapted to the appropriateness of our human condition. God has asked us to do nothing that is impossible for us. In fact, God, if anything, has gone through great lengths to make it easier for us than maybe what some philosophical ideal might have been. God is really trying to work with us here.
To give up the old ways would be just as if a person trained to work as a slave should interrupt his work, clean his hands, and at once fight with real giants.
Right? It's the kind of thing that you would expect to happen. Oh no, there's a giant. Well, let me put down this brick and I'll go take care of it. Maybe in a movie, but not in real life. In real life, a slave is going to go, ah, and run, because that has been the nature of their existence.
It was a result of God's wisdom that they were led in the wilderness till they acquired courage. It is a well-known fact that traveling in the wilderness and privation of bodily enjoyments, such as bathing, produce courage, while the reverse is the source of faint-heartedness. Besides, another generation rose during the wanderings that had not been accustomed to degradation and slavery.
All right, so Rambam is saying very clearly, when you rough it, you become a tougher person. And we needed to be toughened up from what we had gone through in slavery, and we also needed to have more self-respect, to not have a generation that didn't know what it was like to be humiliated as a slave. So for those two reasons, God is going to take the long road to get us into the land of Israel. Good, but we still have some philosophical questions we have to untangle.
You ask, what could have prevented God from commanding us directly, that which is the chief object, and from giving us the capacity of obeying it? What prevented God from leading the Israelites through the way of the land of the Philistines and endowing them with strength for fighting? Why has he not given us the capacity of continually believing in Torah and following its guidance, instead of holding out to us reward for obedience and punishment for disobedience, or of actually giving all the predicted reward and punishment?
Okay, so what are these three questions all basically asking? Why doesn't God just make me do what God wants?
Because then you wouldn't have free will.
So? But God would get what God wants. He would get me doing what God wants. Right? If God wants me to go to the land of Israel, just make me start marching and I'll get there. And if he wants me to fight the Philistines, then you control my sword and I'll defeat the Philistines.
He could wave a magic wand and take away our Yetzer Hara, but...
Exactly. If you don't want me to commit adultery, why do you make me look at other people, right? I mean, this is the lament of every sinner ever, which is, it's your fault, God. If you didn't want me to eat the bacon, why did you make it smell so good? Why did you let my hand pick it up, right? Why did you let me put it in my mouth? You could have said no, and a giant hand from heaven would have pushed my hand down. Well, if there are things that are bad that I shouldn't do, why do you let me do them? And if there are things that are good that I should do, why don't you make me do them? Then I would do only good and never do bad. I mean, this is a real question. It's a real frustration for anyone who has ever struggled with their faith and trying to live according to the good path of Torah. It is frustrating sometimes that we're not just programmed to do it automatically and naturally.
But that's not man.
That's not being human.
If you don't choose to do it and strive to do it and engage in the struggle, then you're not doing God's will. In fact, you're doing, you're like an angel. You're like an automaton. And that's not how you were made. You were made with the freedom of moral choice. And it is required that you get through the struggle in order to do what God wants.
But the argument is, why is it so hard?
Well, I mean, it's not just a question of why is it.
Who was it that said, whatever doesn't kill you makes you strong?
That was actually Nietzsche, and I'm not sure we want to quote him. he and God aren't on good terms. But as comforting as the philosophical explanation can be of, well, God lets me pick up the bacon because that's God giving me free will and I wouldn't want to, God wouldn't have created us without that. In the moment, it's frustrating. And for the 40 years of wandering in the wilderness and for all of the catastrophes that befell the nation from their disobedience and corruption within their own society, at a certain point, you want someone to wave the magic wand and take it all away. Right? This is something that people experience in their life many, many times. I mean, the reason why many people get caught up in cults, the reason why many people get caught up in extreme ideologies or even extreme fandom of particular media, of different movies or of actors or of singers, is because they want to have something that will just tell them what to do and remove the questions, remove the doubt, and remove their free will. Because then they've just yielded all the way over, and now someone else is controlling their life, and at least they know they'll be doing right. Now, all those end in catastrophe, but it's really attractive to a lot of people, and if we're honest, it's attractive to all of us at some point.
There's also the concept of which you see of people believing in nothing and drawn to nothing.
I mean, the nihilists are also out there a lot, who just,
I mean,
and the people who just say there's no such thing as right and wrong, but that is also a response to this, right? If right and wrong were easy to do, and if we were automatically doing them whether we felt like it or not, then no one would struggle and say, well, forget right and wrong. It's precisely because of the struggle that a lot of people give up. And they either give up by letting someone else struggle for them, or they give up by saying there is no struggle, I'm going to do what I want.
There's also cognitive reality and emotional reality.
Yeah, we can know certain things, but that doesn't mean we're feeling it.
And looking ahead, I see the answer is going to touch on that.
Okay, well, let's finish up Rambam's quote, because like I said, this is a long passage, and I apologize for bringing this much philosophy, but it is a great example of just exactly how deep each verse is in the Torah, and how a seemingly innocuous travel log of we went right rather than left when we left Egypt is actually containing a great deal of wisdom about life and how we should explore it. All right, onward.
There is one answer to these three questions.
Which is good, because that means we're actually going to finish on time.
And to all questions of the same character, and it is this. Although in every one of the signs, the natural property of some individual being is changed, the nature of man is never changed by God by way of a miracle.
Right, so yes, people died when the plague of the firstborn came. That happened, right? And those people fell over. But their nature, their actual character, and what it is to be a human being, that was not changed. Living or dead, that was changed. If you get hit by a meteor, you're changed by having a big hole in you now. But who you are as a person, God is not fiddling with that, even through a miracle. Onward.
It is in accordance with this important principle that God said in Deuteronomy, "Oh, that there were such a heart in them, that they would fear me."
Again, remember the word fear. Biblical Hebrew means not just like fear. It means like an overriding and overwhelming sense of awe and respect. But what this verse is saying is that what does God want is that we choose to respect what God has given us and what God has shown us as the path to live. And that's something that God is hoping for, because God will not do it for us.
But this is the heart in that. It's not that they are mindful.
Heart and mind are the same in biblical idiom, right? The idea of having cognitive and emotional as being separate parts of our body and self is not found in biblical thinking.
But the heart and fear is not something that they're going to hear me, but that they're going to internalize it.
Well, they'll definitely internalize it and all of that, but he wants us to do that ourselves. God's not doing it for us, and that's what God's looking for. And again, but wait, couldn't God do it? And Rambam answers that too.
I do not say this because I believe that it is difficult for God to change the nature of every individual person, but it has never been his will to do it. It never will be.
Of course, God could make us all puppets. God's God, right? If God wanted us to all be little puppets that went around doing exactly what God wanted us to do constantly in terms of the outcome behavior, but not the internal emotional state, God could do that. There's no limitation on God's power here. It's a limitation on what God wants from us and the world. And how do we know incontrovertibly that God does not want to simply make us do this?
If it were part of his will to change the nature of any person, the mission of the prophets and the giving of the law would have been altogether superfluous.
Why would God give us Torah and then give us the prophets later to try and reinforce its teachings if God was just going to wave a wand and make us do it? I don't need to know the law if I am forced to obey the law, right? If my car automatically will not go past the speed limit on a given street that has been posted by the government, I'm not keeping the speed limit anymore. I don't even need to know what the speed limit is. I just push go, the car goes, and it will go to whatever speed is posted there. I don't even need to know what that law is. Right? If there's a law about seatbelts and the seatbelt pushes over me automatically, I don't even need to know there is a law about seatbelts. All I know is that when I sit down, the seatbelt goes over me. Right? there are indeed some cars that do that. But the question would be that if there was a law that told me that, I wouldn't need to know the law. All I would know was that my life automatically conformed to a certain set of behaviors, and that's all I can do. I have no choice to do but that. I would not need the Torah to live that life. I would just be carried through life by the circumstances of my existence as God had programmed them. And apparently God doesn't want that because he gave us a book, which implies that we can't live like that, but that instead we have to do the hard work of figuring it out and choosing over and over and over constantly every moment of our life to actually do the right thing for that moment. And that's going to get tiring, that's going to get frustrating, and that's going to make us want a magic wand to take it all away. But no, that's what it is to be human. That's what it is to live the way God has asked us to live. And we don't get a choice. And God has even tried to stack the deck to give us the best chance to make the right choices. But ultimately, the choice is still going to be ours. Make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. And you can see, by the way, with this, as a corollary to Rambam's earlier text about why he doesn't think it's a test, just to give us more reward, Rambam does not see God as setting up unfair tests, as setting up some, well, if I make your life more miserable, let's see how you handle that. It's no, God wants us to pass and is trying to make it as easy as possible to pass. But in the end, we still have to pass the test.
As Mike says, in order to remove that stumbling block, it's,
Right.
it's really the attribute of mercy that's
Doing
doing this.
Right. God couldn't have made it easier for
And
us,
that's the paradox.
literally, and still have us be human. But we still have to be human. And that means we're still going to make choices. All right, just another couple quick texts because they were just too pretty to leave. But that was sort of the main thrust, but I wanted you to also get a couple other interpretations.
Because the people were close to the Lord, as stated in Psalm 148, verse 14. For Israel, the people close to him.
All right, so remember I told us our ki karofu could be interpreted not as close to the land, meaning the land was nearby, but instead that we were close to God. Well, this is Datzikanim trying to say that that's exactly what it means. And why would this matter?
This is the reason why God, led them, as is the custom of the world, and not on a magic carpet.
So he's answering the question of why are we being led at all? Right? Why are we being led at all? Why are we walking, God? Right? Why are we walking? We could have been teleported. Exactly. We could have walked out of our doors in Egypt and magically appeared in the land of Canaan, right? Instead, that's not how God does things, right? Because God is close to us. God will do things close to this world, the way this world happens. If you're expecting miracles constantly that involve teleportation or other things, magic carpets, you're going to be disappointed because that's not the way God structured the world. The world is going to operate according to natural laws, and God is going to operate as close to possible with those laws on a day-to-day basis so that God and us will be close, rather than God will be doing Hollywood miracles left, right, and center. Good insight? I know, we all miss out on our magic carpet ride, but instead we get a magic life ride. Onward.
Because it is close, and this is Ramban, because it is close, and it would be easy to return on that same path to Egypt. The language of Rashi and Ibn Ezra.
All right, so basically Rashi and Ibn Ezra say the reason why it was close was a problem, meant that it would make a U-turn very easy, right? If you get 10 feet out of your driveway and you realize that you forgot something, it's easy to go back and get it. If you get 100 feet away and you realize this is hard, it's easy to go back and hide again in the land of Egypt. So that's their argument.
Because the reason that God did not lead them on the path of the land of the Philistines was because it was close.
Right? Ki karofu, because it was close, they didn't go that way. Right? The closeness was why it was disqualified.
And they would regret and return to Egypt immediately. But according to my understanding,
because Ramban likes to argue with both Rashi and Ibn Ezra, lots.
if it is like their words, because God said, would have been first.
Right? Basically, if that's what God had wanted to say, then it would have been written in a different place, right? He would have said the Ki Amar, right? And God, because God said, the second half of that verse 17, that would have been written before the Ki Karofu, that because it is close. So he's making a grammatical argument that if you wanted to say that God did not want them to go in the easy route because it was close, then God should have said, they may have a change of heart, therefore I won't send them this way because it's close. That's the order of the sentence. But that's not the order of the sentence, which means it must mean something different.
But the verse says, God led them not by the way of the land of the Philistines, for God said, lest. But the correct understanding that it is saying, God led them not by the way of the land of the Philistines, which is close, and it would be good to lead them on that path, because God said,
that should be lest, yes.
lest the people regret when they see war and they return to Egypt.
So Ramban is taking probably the simplest interpretation that we've got, at least at the moment. There's another way to interpret him, but he's basically saying, God was saying, I don't want to take them this way because of the war, right? And he was saying, even though it's close, and even though being close would make it the desirable route, it's a way that will lead them to a set pitched battle, and that they may not be ready for. Other commentators, I highly recommend reading all of the commentators you can find. Other commentators argue that there's a difference between the war with the Philistines that would have been and the war with the Amalekites that was, very shortly in our story, which is the Amalekites don't have a set territory in this area, so there wasn't a pitched battle. But the Philistines, it would have been a different type of warfare rather than fighting off bandits. So there's much more to be said about this whole struggle, about the nature of transition from being a slave to being a free person, about embracing one's free will when one used to be enslaved. All of these things, keep studying and keep making good choices. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, today was the National